This week's Old Testament lectionary reading is Exodus 3 1 through 15. It's the story of Moses meeting God's people and being called to partner with God to deliver the people of Israel from slavery in Egypt. Moses was grazing the family sheep on Mount Horeb, which is just the Hebrew word for dry, but with a really strong tense that gives the sense that the mountain is totally parched. There's just no water to be found anywhere. And there's some really cool things happening in this passage. This is where we learn God's name for the first time. But there's also some really weird stuff here, like a bush that is on fire but isn't consumed. The way the Hebrew describes this bush is really interesting. The word is very rarely used, and it's difficult to translate, and that's not a modern problem. Rabbis have been discussing this for dozens of centuries. The consensus among the rabbis is that this is a thoroughly unimpressive plant. It's a scrawny little thorn bush that's barely clinging to life, and frankly, it's just taking up space and resources that would be better used on other plants. It's not good for anything, for people, or for animals. Basically, it's exactly the kind of plant that you would expect to grow on a mountain that's named parched. It was common in the ancient Near East for gods to be associated with trees. Certain deities had sacred trees that were planted in holy groves or used in worship in various ways, but they were always grand and majestic and worthy of representing the divine. But that's not how the God of the Bible operates. The God of the Bible doesn't need temples and sacred groves or any of those traditional trappings of power. When God wants to make an appearance and provide an introduction, they just show up in the most unimpressive plant possible. This waste of space is the place where God chooses to show up and be present. It's like God is identifying with Israel's degradation and humiliation in Egypt. This also continues the theme that we saw all throughout Genesis, where God identifies with and works with the least and the last and the most unlikely. I think it says something about God's character. The God that we encounter here doesn't need all of that empty pomp to be worthy of worship. There's another really interesting thing about this burning bush story that doesn't come across if you're only familiar with Christian perspectives. Some rabbis have proposed, based on the wording of the Hebrew, that this bush didn't suddenly catch on fire when God wanted to talk to Moses, but that the bush was always burning, and that from the beginning of creation, no one had ever noticed that it was on fire until Moses did. Moses was the first person who was attentive and curious enough about the world to be open to God's message. This means that the story isn't about the call of a clueless prophet, but there were already signs that Moses was going to be a good ally with God in the conspiracy to redeem God's people. I think that's a really cool take, even though I don't think it's actually the case. It's hard enough to parse out what's supposed to be history versus poetry versus mythology in the Hebrew Bible without trying to say that a bush had been on fire since plant life had evolved on Earth. But I think there's a truth behind the interpretation that we shouldn't miss. According to this perspective, the bush was already burning when Moses noticed it. God was just waiting for the right time to begin the series of events that would result in the people of Israel being rescued from slavery. The Hebrew in this passage makes it very clear that God was actively watching everything that was going on in Egypt and was not a passive spectator. So whether or not you think the bush was always burning or just started burning for Moses, or that this is just a bit of ancient creative writing, the truth behind this passage is that God is already at work in the world to bring liberation and healing to people who are being oppressed.